Hello and welcome to this session on using your reading effectively for your dissertations. So what are we actually going to be doing in this session? Well, the aims of this session, that is what I'm hoping you'll be able to do or start doing after we've gone through this presentation, will be really you'll be able to take control of your dissertation writing process. In order to use our reading and research effectively, we really need to be in control of this process, to have a plan, to have a process, a strategy. So hopefully you'll be able to do that or have some ideas about how to start approaching that. And in order to do that, we're going to look at some strategies to help you organise your reading and your research. And so you will be able to develop those further and apply them. And I'm going to present some organisational systems to help you put your research into a usable order to be applied and used within your dissertation. And you'll be able to evaluate which of the ones of the suggestions and the systems that I put forward are most useful to you, which maybe you'll take some parts of each one. And then you'll be able to describe then a process where you can use your notes and your reading to start building a plan and writing your dissertation. So that's what I'm aiming to give you throughout this presentation. So the very first thing to start with is a two-step strategy that we're going to look at to help you begin to focus on how you're going to use your reading in your dissertation. How are you going to use all those notes, all that research in your dissertation? So two-step strategy. The first strategy is to move away from your notes, and what I'm proposing is, first of all, and please bear in mind that this process is after your note-taking stage. We should really only approach this phase of our dissertation writing if we have completed our research. Now, that's not to say as we move into the writing process that you won't possibly do a little bit more reading, as you notice that some things need a little bit more substance or more information. But really, when we're approaching this phase, we should have finished the vast majority of our reading. One of the difficulties we have is when we try to read and write at the same time, and that's particularly difficult with something as complex as a dissertation. So, even if you're writing this chapter by chapter, you should have, by and large, finished the reading for the chapter that you're starting to write. And this presentation really is a process which I kind of see as a bridge between that reading stage, that research stage, note-making stage, and the writing stage. This is a bridge, a strategy, a process to move you from that stage to the next. So what I'm proposing is we finished our note-making, our reading, so we step back and we refocus and we look at our big picture. Let's just focus overall on what we have to write. What are the chapters? What are the sections? If we're writing a desk-based or a non-empirical dissertation, what chapters or sections have you decided upon with your supervisor? Or do you need to refine that a little bit? Do you need to look and redefine what each chapter is going to be about now you've finished your reading? If you're doing an empirical dissertation based on your own research, what is the order of chapters that have been suggested or given to you in your module handbooks on Canvas or discussion with your supervisor? And just focusing very roughly on what goes in each chapter and section. Just focusing on the big dissertation picture. So this is the first step in moving from reading to writing. First step from using our reading to writing and using it in our chapters. So we're just focusing Step away from the notes, just refocus. What is it you're doing? And you might want to write this as a mind map. So if you're doing an empirical dissertation, you might write introduction, literature review, methodology, results, etc. If you're doing a non-empirical or desk-based dissertation, obviously your chapters will be related to the themes and topics you've decided to focus on in the dissertation. But this is the first step in beginning to bridge between our reading and our writing. After you've done that, after you've just reacquainted yourselves, possibly read, looked at information, checked that you understand, what goes in each chapter, which may mean that you go back to your reading again. Maybe you look again, okay, I've got to write a methodology section. Oh, right, I don't think I've got enough notes for that. I need to go back and maybe do some more reading for that chapter. After we've focused on the big, chunky picture of our whole dissertation, that's theoretical. What we need to do now is to move and really focus on our own dissertation. So again, moving from, immersing ourselves in detail in a lot of texts, looking in detail at lots of journal papers and research, we're just stepping back and reacquainting ourselves with our whole dissertation, with the big overall structure. And now once we've got that clear in our mind, we go back and look again at our particular research area. So we might want to just review our aims and objectives. What did we set out to do? We might want to rewrite those. We might want to perhaps just sit and chat to ourselves about what our dissertation is about, just to refocus, to start finding clarity. Some other suggestions which can help us start to really focus on using our reading effectively in our writing is to think about writing an abstract, or to think about drafting a contents list. This begins to help us really focus on our dissertation, what we are writing about specifically, as opposed to the general chapters that you might have in a big picture view, which might be very similar to lots of other people's dissertations. Then we move into looking at our own work again. So, these are strategies that I'm proposing to help us begin to focus on how we're going to use this research. And I'm just thinking, have a little think. Why am I suggesting those? Why do you think it might be useful to review, rewrite, talk to yourself about your aims and objectives? Why might writing an abstract be useful to help you refocus on what you're actually going to use all this research for? How might a contents list be useful? Have a little think. Okay, well, an abstract, remember, is an overview of your whole piece. So your dissertation abstract should reflect the content of all chapters of your dissertation. So writing a draft abstract as a starting point for this process of how we're going to use all that research can really help us focus on what it is we're going to be writing across the whole piece, the whole of our dissertation. Helps us refocus on what we've done and what we'll need to really show to the reader in the chapters of our dissertation. And remember that this task here, this might not be the final abstract that you use in your dissertation. In fact, it quite likely won't be. And you could just write it as bullet points or use these sentence starters to address each area. But what you're trying to do is get back into your head what it was you've researched, what the problem or issue was, focusing again on why you wanted to do that, why it was important, how you studied, how you carried out your research, and what that showed you, what you found out, and what's the conclusion, what does all that mean? Writing an abstract following these questions, using perhaps these sentence starters, is really refocusing us again on this process that we've gone through in creating the notes, in pulling together research. So an abstract can be really helpful just to help us really gain control again, an overview, a controlled overview of our whole dissertation. The contents list idea is a way of refocusing and thinking about how we're using our reading. One method of doing this is to just get a piece of paper or open a Word document and write introduction at the top and conclusion in the bottom. And then between that, you start thinking about possible structures, what you're actually going to start including, what order they're going to be in. And again, this is focusing us on what we've read, what we've researched, and how we're going to start using that research, that reading in our writing. And, it might be useful at this point to have a look at some other dissertations. John Moores holds a repository of dissertations. Some of these are obviously high level PhD, some are masters, but looking at those can be a really good, guide to us to how we might start structuring our dissertation in detail, and that will reflect how we've carried out our research and what we've read. And, again, this is just a contents list that might change as you move into the writing process. In a more concrete way, you might decide to change the order of chapters or sections, but this is a way of just focusing on how we're going to start using that reading. And again, you might want to explain this to a friend, talk to yourself. Why are you going to put these things in this order? How are they linked? Why in your mind does one thing? So if you think about chapters beyond their topic. So if we look at these two lists, as you can see, this list on the left, we've got introduction, background, definitions, literature review, topic 1, for example. But the list on the right is much more detailed. So the list on the right, obviously this list is extremely detailed, and this is really a contents list from something at high master's or PhD level. So we might not have this if we're writing at undergraduate level. But what we're trying to do is to write a table of contents that reflects what we've researched and what we need to tell the reader about in each of the sections. So just writing a list which is introduction, background, definitions, that's keeping us at that big picture level, which was useful to maybe just refresh our memory about what we've got to construct. But it's not particularly helpful for us in thinking in detail about how we're going to apply and use our reading. A more detailed list obviously links more to the topics and themes we've seen emerge throughout our research, linking to the overall themes and topics for each chapter. So as you can see in the left-hand list, this student's just written methodology and results, but that doesn't really indicate anything. What are you talking about in relation to methodology? Is there a section where you explain your research design? Is there a section where you justify the different methodological approach that you've chosen? That level of detail helps us focus on how we're going to write, helps us focus on what we've researched and whether we've researched enough, and starts helping us build a more constructive view of how we're moving from reading and researching to writing. So these are a number of strategies: reviewing your aims and objectives, getting it all back in your head, writing an abstract which reflects your overall structure and content, or writing a detailed contents list that reflects your reading and helps you start thinking about how you're going to organise that reading. Now, once we've gone through those two initial steps, we feel that we've got, a good idea about where we're going structurally and where we're going in terms of detail and using our reading across our dissertation. We really need to approach the next phase as we're crossing this bridge from our research to our writing. It's absolutely critical that we get organised in order to address this next part of our dissertation journey as in an organised a fashion as we can. And this means that we do really at this point need to think about time. And we've probably done that before, but it's worth just thinking about some strategies, because we have to now move into using our time very meaningfully. If you've constructed a detailed contents list, you'll start seeing, how many sections you're going to need to write. If you've written an abstract, you're going to see how many points need to be made clear to the reader. So what we need to do is to think about how now we're going to use those strategies as a kind of beginning planning strategy to help us start writing, and how we're going to break that down, and how we're going to use time effectively to help us achieve the writing and the content that would match with our draft contents list, for example. So some ideas of time management. You've probably got perhaps strategies you've used yourself. Perhaps you've used some strategies in the past and then stopped using them. One simple strategy is this one of time blocking. And time blocking means that we write a list similar to this. Some people do this the night before. Some people do it first thing in the morning. Some people like to do this, on a weekly or even a monthly basis. The night before seems to work for me, and that especially at the moment, allows for changes and things happening. But rather than just thinking, tomorrow I am going to write my dissertation, or tomorrow I am doing my literature review, what we do with time blocking is that we actually acknowledge the reality of our lives. So what we do first of all is we look at our day in blocks of time, hourly blocks perhaps to start with. And you put into those blocks things you absolutely have to do. Things that commitments, family activities, possibly you're still working. Obviously in this situation we're in at the moment, you might work in your hourly exercise, or you might be, undertaking some other kind of hobby or activity. Work those things in to your day. And then once you've put those things in, what you're left with are blocks of time. Now, you obviously need to put in time for eating and drinking, but as these blocks of time appear, what's really important is that we link them to very specific and concrete activities, not write my dissertation. Because writing your dissertation as an instruction or directive for what you're going to do the next day is really too big. And so when we sit down with thinking we're going to do that, we spend a lot of time wondering where to start. So if we overcome that by using, say, that contents list, or using our overview we've gained from our abstract to think about what we're going to do, and then we start linking that to this time blocking strategy, what we emerge with is a very simple time management system, which means that we've linked our time to our tasks really effectively. So as you can see on this, I obviously break my day down in this way. And you'll see here, I put 8 to 9 emails, and then I've broken down that further, 8 to 8:25, 8:30, 8:55. This ties with another aspect or strategy we're going to look at in detail in a little while. But remember, don't be too hard on yourself if you don't meet all your tasks. Just move them to the next day. Remember that as deadlines approach, you might need to pull back on some of your own personal activities if possible and put in a little bit more work. And also tie your timetable to what you know about yourself. I'm a morning person, so I tend to do more work in the morning. If you're an evening or a night owl, you might want to adjust your planning accordingly. But as you can see, this is a very concrete plan. So as I go through my day, I know what I'm doing at each time. I'm not just saying generally, tomorrow I've got to do this, that and the other. I've tied it to time. And this is a way that we are controlling our time. If we look at this quotation, this person's saying that, their day rarely goes exactly how it's planned. And that's true for all of us. I might sit down to do my emails and then get interrupted with a phone call. Or I might sit down to set off to go shopping and, end up in this situation. I've given myself an hour and I might actually queue outside the supermarket for an hour. So things do alter and change. But having this time blocking technique, as this person is saying, does keep you on task. And I think this point is very interesting, that they're suggesting it means they're less likely to go down the Instagram or social media rabbit hole or get distracted because they've given themselves a time block. Now remember, those time blocks can be stretched. They don't have to be an hour. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail with another technique now. But, if you give yourself 2 hours with possible breaks to achieve something, and then you become distracted and end up spending 45 minutes of that time on your phone, that means that you're pushing your day on. So whereas you might have planned a schedule with the time blocking technique to end at 6 because you want to go and, go for a run, or, you want to catch up on the next 2 episodes of a box set, or you want to be involved in, a house party quiz with friends or family. So that means that you've pushed it back simply by being distracted. So the thing about this time blocking is that this is like a to-do list, but with a to-do list, we can work through it at any point. So I don't know about you, but I've written lots of to-do lists and they're still there, and I wrote them 3 months ago. Whereas with time blocking, we are specifically connecting things we need to do with the time we're going to do it. And that creates much more of a structure and helps us understand what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. And this is a really useful strategy to start applying as we move from our researching phase, our reading phase, into our writing phase. And one thing that I'd like to talk about is a little bit about distractions. When I run this session, often in the chat box and in class, people comment on things they find distracting. More often than not, it tends to be mobile phones and social media. So you might have to think about how you're going to stop those distractions. You might want to build into your time blocking some times of the day when you actually allow yourself to look at social media. I look at Twitter usually about 6 o'clock. I have a sit down and a cup of tea around 6, and I look at my Twitter feed. So, these can be rewards and also can be put in as part of your time blocking planning, which means you're less likely to start looking and doing those things when you should be doing something else. You might also need to think about putting blocks on your phone, putting your phone into airplane mode. Some people have suggested they've gone as far as, deleting apps off of their phone when they're particularly close to a deadline or finding them very distracting. Other people take apps off their phone and use web-based apps, which means that it's much more complex to get into them, so they're less likely to look at them. Some people leave phones in other rooms, and there are a whole range of time blocking apps that you can actually download to your phone, which means that you put your phone into a timed mode through the app, and that means that you can't actually access it through the times that you set. So do think about controlling distractions, what distracts you, and how you might overcome that to be able to use a time management strategy specifically. So what we're looking at here is time blocking and gaining control, because once we've done that, we're much more likely to approach this strategy, this writing phase in an organized manner, and we're more likely to start using our reading efficiently, because we're not just generally sitting down every time going, I'm writing my dissertation, rummaging through piles of notes, wondering what I'm going to look at today. We've thought about the dissertation, we've thought about it in detail, we've thought about what we actually have to construct, and then once we've got that in our minds, then we can tie that to a time blocking, time management strategy so we can move forward in an organised manner. So what you'll see here is your time blocking is not write dissertation. It might be organise files on your laptop, finish notes on a journal paper. These are specific and measurable outcomes for you, which mean that you're more likely to be able to meet them, and you will feel that you are in control of your time, and you will be moving forward in a much more, coherent and organised manner. But do remember, include as far as possible, depending on how close you are to deadlines and how much you've got done, remember to include things outside university work in your time blocking strategy. Now, to go back, as you saw on my daily timetable, my emails I'd organised between 8 and 9, but I'd broken that down to 8:25, 5 minutes missing, 8:30. 8:55, and this is because I use this Pomodoro technique. Now, the Pomodoro technique is so called because the guy who basically started applying this technique used a timer to break up his work into manageable time blocks. And the timer he used was a tomato. So, and Pomodoro is obviously Italian. Spanish or Italian for tomato? I can't quite remember now. But anyway, so apologies, Spanish and Italian people listening. So basically what you do with this technique is that if you've done your time blocking, so say as I did, I gave myself an hour for emails. I set a timer for 25 minutes. I work through my emails, and then after 25 minutes, when the timer goes off, I stop and have a 5-minute break, and then go back and do 25 more minutes. This means that you've got quite a measured time period to really focus. You've got a break, so 5 minutes, quick walk around, quick glass of water, cup of tea. And then once you've done, 4 Pomodoros or 4 25 minutes, you can take a longer break of 15 or 20 minutes. So this means, again, that you're managing your time, you've time blocked, you know what you're going to do in your time blocks. And then within your time blocks again, you're helping yourself focus on the tasks you've given, knowing that you're going to have a break, knowing that, ultimately after a certain length of time, after, a couple of hours, you're going to have a 20-minute break. So this helps us move through in an organised way. Now, this is a technique. I'm not suggesting that it's going to work for everybody. It does work for me because I like to break things down, and I find it a good way of really focusing and concentrating. 25 minutes from research seems to be the optimum time for concentration, but you might feel you want to make it shorter or longer. But again, this is a strategy to help us really take control of our time, take control of our work, and help us to move through this phase in a really structured and organised way. So, we've got ideas. We've got ideas about what we're going to do. So let's start thinking about our actual notes, our reading itself. Now, the first thing, if you're going to be able to use your notes effectively, is you need to be able to find them. So if your workspace looks something like this at the moment, it's going to be quite difficult for you to start using your reading effectively if it's all scattered about in various different files and places and piles, or if your files on your computers, or if your desktop is just a whole host of different files. It's going to be very difficult for you to start using these techniques to start using your reading and your writing if you can't find your notes. So possibly the very first place you need to start is to try and use some of these ideas, time management ideas, block out your time to actually start organising your notes into files, piles, whatever works for you, so that you can approach writing to some extent in a way that's reflected in this desk, which is organised and in control. So one thing you might want to do is block out time to put all your notes in piles or files related to which chapter they are connected with. Now, this is a nice set of files, and I'm not suggesting that you need to immediately fire off to Amazon to buy them. You might just put things in piles with labels. I know that some people have used supermarket shopping bags to put their notes in with a label on. It's just a way, whatever works for you, of dividing your notes into an organised fashion. So obviously, if you're doing a desk-based dissertation, the notes that relate to each of the chapters you might decide to put into different files or different piles. So, one thing you might want to start with, you might do your first Pomodoro in, you might 10-25 collate paper notes for your literature review. But remember, again, let's use this time blocking technique. If you do need to do this, don't just say, tomorrow I'm going to tidy up. That's vague, unclear. What does it mean? Give yourself a specific time and give yourself a specific task. So if you do need to do this, if you need to organise your notes before you can use them effectively, make sure you make it very clear, right? I'm going to pull together notes for lit review. Here I'm going to put my methodology. These are the notes for chapter 1. Be very specific. And similarly, if you've got that messy computer file, similar thing. Put things into labelled files on Word, or obviously through the university you've got your Microsoft Office 365 account, and you can use OneNote or your OneDrive to do this. But again, think critically about what you've got. Move things about. If you find you've got a lot of files of maybe PDFs that you downloaded that you ultimately found not to be useful, you might want to either delete them or put them in a file together to keep them out of the way, in case you feel you want to come back to them later for another purpose. Look at your notes critically. Again, if you're looking at your paper notes, if you've got things that are sort of scribbled and you can't really understand, is it worth keeping them? Should you just put them in a file again, keep them temporarily, but move them away from your main files and your main notes? So using this time constructively. But just remember, don't use this kind of organisational phase as a procrastination, a technique. We can get really sucked into things like tidying and organising as a way of putting off real concrete work. Obviously, it's really important to be organised and have our notes ready to be used, but we don't want to spend too long beautifully colour coding. These are techniques we might want to use, but we don't want to spend long times. Maybe if we've got some notes which we feel when we look at them, some of them might be relevant to our lit review and some of them we want to use in our methodology. So we might think, well, actually what I'm going to do is, rather than rewrite, I'm just going to highlight the sections for lit review yellow, highlight methodology pink. You don't want to spend hours. It's not a work of art. What we're trying to do here is make our research and reading usable and accessible so we can use it effectively. What we're not trying to do is create our own personal library. So don't be, sucked into a tidying sort of frenzy as a way of putting off actually constructing the dissertation. So, if you've got any top tips, obviously think about it now. What do you do? Have you done anything in the past that you've forgotten you did, that you think, oh, actually, I always used to do that. Maybe I'll go back to it. Or a friend of mine does this. That works for them. Maybe I'll have a go at that. So have a think about, strategies that you might have already used or you've heard of that you think are relevant. But what I'm suggesting is that, first of all, we need to get organised with our reading to use it, and we need to overcome procrastination. What's stopping you getting organised? Or don't use getting organised as something that puts you off progressing with the actual writing of a dissertation. So now we've moved on through this process, passing over this bridge from our reading to our writing. So now we really need to focus in detail. So we need to think about which chapter we're going to start with. Which chapter are we going to take all those notes that we've got in piles and files, and we're going to actually start moving those from note phase to writing the chapter. So once we've decided, we need to really review those notes in detail before we start writing. We've already done a little bit of that as we weeded things out and got organised, but we really need to look critically at the notes that we've taken. At this stage, it's probably good if you've got some notes and you've only written half a reference. It might be a good idea to check that now before you start writing and using them to save time later on. If you've written really lengthy notes, which in fact aren't really notes, you've just sort of copied out or cut and pasted chunks of a particular article, this might be a good opportunity to just spend some time summarising, thinking about the key points you want from those, and writing things out in our own words so that as we use them in our paragraphs and then subsequently our chapters, that we're not going to be just copying from directly from source. And then obviously, the other strategy, once we've done that, is to start thinking about how all these texts and sources link together. And we're going to come on to a strategy which is going to help you do that. But this is how we start moving on now. We've got organised, we've thought about our time management, we've really focused on what it is we've got to achieve, and now we're getting into doing that. So this is the next phase. Now, see, as you're going through this phase, say, for example, you've decided to start with your literature review, as many people do, you know, as you go through your notes, you might begin to feel that you haven't got enough information. And that's perfectly normal. And you might decide to go back and spend a couple more days doing a little bit more reading and coming back to the chapter a little bit later with some more information. So, when I'm talking about reviewing our reading critically and moving on from just collections of notes which loosely can be used in each chapter, which we've identified, what we need to do now is to really look at the links between those different sources so that we can start using them critically in our writing, start using them effectively. And one way of doing that is to use a reading grid like this. And in a reading grid, what we do is we look at the sources that we have read. And we are thinking, if we look here, we've got themes in research about PhD students. So this particular person is writing about PhD students and what people say about them in journal papers. And the areas that they are researching are listed here. They're looking at what people say from research about the reasons they found people do a PhD. They're looking at what research is saying generally about completion rates on PhDs. They're looking about social learning and students working in student-based communities to help, with their studies. And they're also looking at PhD students' relationships with their supervisor. So these are their themes. These are the themes that we're going to see developed across the chapters of this person's thesis, their dissertation. So what they've done is they've taken their themes and they've started then looking at their research and connecting the research to the themes they want to write about. So, for example, we look at this section on how often or the amount of research that talks about people completing PhD programs. So what they've got here is that these researchers show more men than women drop out. This one says that older people who are part-time students are more likely to persevere. This student says that, there's differences between students staying and completing a PhD, depending on which institution they're at. So what they've done is they've started moving their reading on, and you can do this with your reading. So if you're going to do your literature review, think about the themes that you want to write about that are key from your research, and then start building a view of what the writers are saying in relation to those themes. And then that really helps us, because now what we're seeing is we're constructing paragraphs, because we can see here that this paragraph is based on this section here about completion rates. And so, we're looking at why people take a PhD, and, if what motivates them to do this, whether this is connected with whether they actually persevere. So, what we're trying to see here is looking at how this particular grid and this information from the reading can be organised and analysed to help us start actually writing our chapters and our paragraphs. So, where are we up to? What have we covered? Well, at this point, we've got a time management strategy in place with some ideas about how that can be organised. We've reviewed the purpose of the whole dissertation. We've also thought about what might go in each section. And we've used that section plan to help us start organising our notes. And then we've begun to move through our notes and reviewing them critically to build reading and writing grids, which are going to help us build and write our paragraphs. So, obviously, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. But these are the strategies that you might want to apply in order to start beginning to use your reading effectively in your writing.